Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to Conscious 2. My guest in studio today is Will Pye. Hi, Will.
Hi, Alex.
And Will is a social entrepreneur, an author, and wisdom teacher, and has just recently published his first book, which is called Blessed with a Brain Tumor. And we filmed a previous interview talking about the story of Will's diagnosis and how it affected his life, which obviously in a significant way. So if you want to get the full story, you can watch that. In this interview, we're going to come more into some of the teaching that's emerged from Will's experience around radical gratitude. But Will, maybe just a starting point for people that haven't seen the original interview.
Sure.
Maybe just say a little bit about what happened. So February 2011,
Yeah.
you had a pretty life-changing experience.
Yeah, I experienced a grand mal seizure whilst I was exercising and lost consciousness and so on, and discovered that I had a brain tumor. Initially, a doctor communicated to me that there was a lump in my brain, and what was curious at that point of communication was that there was no stress or suffering, and indeed, for the months following, there was no stress or suffering. I managed to recreate the capacity to create stress and suffering after that, but for that first period, there was no stress, no suffering, no worry or concern or fear around this diagnosis. Indeed, the opposite was true. I experienced it with fascination, with curiosity, with joy, with love. It was a wonderful experience, wouldn't change it for the world, and sensed it was very much part of my life journey.
Yes.
Clearly that's not a typical experience of a diagnosis of a condition that could end your life in a short period of time.
And we should also say that you eventually had surgery, and it turned out that it was also a cancerous tumor that you had removed as well. It was another big shock, of course.
Yes. Although intriguingly, at the same moment or in that experience also, there was an initial disappointment on finding out that it was cancerous, because that meant more treatment was necessary, and I had a busy schedule planned for the coming 6 months.
Sounds very inconvenient.
It was highly inconvenient. Life is like that sometimes, isn't it? And I, for half an hour, experienced that sense of being troubled, disappointed. And my father then asked me when we spoke, well, how are you feeling? And I actually really checked in with how I was feeling. And I felt peace, and I felt joy. And on noticing that I was feeling peace and joy, I felt overwhelming gratitude, because, again, that's not a typical experience to have at that moment.
Yes. And that's really what I want to get into in this interview. You know, the previous interview we did was more of a kind of what happened and how it affected you.
Sure.
What I want to understand here is how did you respond in the way that you did? You know, what were and I understand that it was a kind of instinctive response that you had, but also there were a number of years previously of, you know, inner work, let's say, that you'd done.
Yes.
And, you know, for people watching this that are maybe not going through something as severe as a brain tumor, but certainly maybe struggling with their life, really want to explore how they can actively cultivate more gratitude.
Sure.
So how do we do that? You know, how did you do that, and how can others do that?
Well, the idea of radical gratitude came from really asking that question: is how can this experience be useful? How can I extract the essence from this?
So that was an active question you were asking.
Absolutely. Curiously, in those first months, the title "Blessed with the Brain Tumor" came into my mind, and there was excitement that it was a brain tumor rather than, say, liver cancer, because it just wouldn't work in quite the same way.
Okay.
There was a sense of what was emerging, and a desire to understand what the essence was there, how that experience was, that it was experienced in that way, such that I could share it and help others suffer less. Of course, not necessarily with brain tumors. In fact, I feel a great sensitivity about approaching individuals who are in the midst of a life crisis with a message of it's all gift, because that may be creating suffering for that individual who's in the midst of their fear and so on.
Yeah, I guess if someone's instinctive response is different, then there can be a judgment about their response, or it should be another way. And of course, you know, it's a hugely challenging, let's say, experience to have. But you did something different, and that's pretty amazing. So, how? You know, partly you ask the kind of question, you know, and that partly helps in a sense. What does your brain come up with as answers? You know, and you're kind of, how can I use this? And
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
so you're asking the question, how can I use this in a positive way? How can I be grateful for this? How can I? So what was the response that came as you explored it in that way?
To be a source of love and truth in the world. So at a young age, I determined that my ambition, along with meeting lots of pretty women and making lots of money, the usual stuff, was to be a positive effect upon every single individual that I met in every single circumstance.
Yes.
And as that morphed or developed, it became being a source of love and truth in the world, which was a crazy ambition because I was as full of bitterness, selfishness, ignorance, anger, shame, self-loathing, fear, all the usual stuff as anyone. And that intention, that desire, that ambition had driven a process, a quest to understand the nature of reality with a specific focus to change, to transform, to get away from my pain, to get away from my suffering, and always with a sense of understanding the practical applications of it that I could share with others and so on as well.
Well, one of the things that you talk about in the book is how, in a sense, we create our own reality by the lens through which we perceive it. Can you say a bit more about that, and how that helps you cultivate, in a sense, a different experience because of the meanings that you placed upon what was happening?
For sure. So that we create our own reality is a more common idea, meme, theme in life these days, and yet it's problematic in that it tells half the story because, of course, we do and we don't. However, we certainly create our experience of reality. This is easy to see. If I look outside and see that it's raining, and I believe a thought that it's bad when it rains and that, oh no, it's raining, then I create the experience of rain being bad. I create the experience of bad weather. If I look outside and say, how wonderful, there's precipitation falling from the sky that's going to cause things to grow, and how delightful, and go and dance in the rain, it becomes a wonderful experience. That's a simple example of how our experience of reality we certainly create, and this is easy to see by the thoughts we have, by the lens that we choose to hold reality with.
And I think it is a simple thing, but most people don't do it.
Sure.
You know, and I wonder about that, about what you see that helps people or helped you to choose to see things differently. Because I think, you know, most people get that the meaning we make creates our experience. You know, certainly if you've hung around the kind of self-development world at all, it's kind of teaching number one almost.
Sure.
But most people don't do it. And I'm wondering what you felt supported you, I guess partly the intensity of your experience. What do you think helps someone engage in that way?
Suffering. Yeah, so if we're not living life to the fullest, if we're not awake in this moment, as a friend said to me recently, we haven't suffered enough yet. So suffering has a divine purpose. It causes us to question, it causes us to look at different ways of doing things. And my experience was to live life dysfunctionally for a long period of time and explore how that dysfunction wasn't working for me and try more functional ways. So the moment that radical gratitude really arose in my experience, I was experiencing the the arising of energy and emotion and so on that we would that doctors would term depression.
Yes.
I never termed it depression because I was miserable enough without having an illness.
Sure.
So
so true.
This didn't seem to be helpful for me either because I didn't see it as a biochemical issue.
Yes.
Although of course that is an element of that experience and it can be a helpful lens. For me it was a mind issue. It was an issue of inquiry. And after many years of resisting that energy when it arose, that pain, pushing it away, not wanting to feel it, with the usual drugs, sex, exercise. As I grew up, it became more socially acceptable, work and so on. I, one day, in a moment of frustration and desperation, because after all that I had done in terms of practice and so on, in terms of transformational inquiry, I still had this pain coming up into my experience. And out of curiosity and intuitive sense, I welcomed it. I spoke to it and I said, thank you for being here. And in that moment, the energy shifted. In that moment, it went. And then there was another 10 years or so of working with it and so on. But in that moment, my suffering ended, and I realized just how powerful our perspective is.
And I think that's part of what is so interesting, that, so much of our society is designed to avoid suffering, to try and change suffering. The whole therapy world, of course, it clearly has its place around trying to alleviate suffering. But it's interesting what you're saying, because I've also had a version of the experience what you're describing, where you actually recognize that suffering is the catalyst for something else to awaken, the catalyst to actually engage differently. And I think that surrender, I'm wondering, did that just happen in that moment? Were you trying to cold? Where did the surrender come from? That's really my question.
We may say grace or good fortune. So surrender cannot be ordered, it cannot be willed. True surrender. If me wants to surrender, if I want to surrender, then I'm negotiating with reality. So in that moment, I think it is good fortune, or grace, we might say.
Because I think that's also you mentioned that you had that moment, then you had 10 years kind of working with it. And that's one of the things that also fascinates me, that when we have an experience of almost surrender arising and it changes, we then try to recreate that. So it almost becomes a new trick. If I can just surrender to it, then so we're not surrendering to it, we're surrendering to it so it goes away.
Absolutely. So I call this a negotiated surrender.
Right. That's good.
Like
good term for it.
If I love you, this might be the feeling that I'm speaking to, you'll go away. But of course the feeling that is arising wants actual love. It wants presence. It wants attention. And it's in that attention, it's in that surrender that we offer, in that awareness, simply allowing it to be there in our experience, that the transformation occurs.
Yes. And it's such a difficult thing for the conscious kind of egoic mind to understand, because there isn't any doing, there isn't any active process in it, and yet all it knows how to do is to try and do something.
Yes.
I'm also curious, you talk in the book about the place where we create our realities, what we've been touching on, but there's also a place where we co-create our reality. Can you say something about that?
Sure. So that we create our experience is easy to grasp, I think, even for all of us that are conditioned in a materialist, reductionist perspective on what is real and what all this is. That we create our reality, that this form is a reflection, an expression of this inner world, is less easy to grasp and involves more subtlety. And certainly even then, it's not just this being, of course, that we are all co-creating, and there are forces beyond those of humans as well. So we have to be careful with the idea that we create our reality. We do and we don't. However, quantum mechanics and mysticism each offer, in fact, one doesn't even need to get into quantum mechanics. Modern science tells us that all is one. It tells us that everything is the same thing. It's energy, we might say, a term that physicists have a problem with because in New Age circles it's got a
They got there first.
yeah, absolutely. But it's funny to see how some of the crossover between some of the cliches and quotes of the 60s and 70s that we would deride, follow your heart and so on, are actually being proven now by modern science, such as neurocardiology and so on. So the other perspective by which we can realize that all this is one thing, all this is connected, is through mystical experience, or through accessing non-dual consciousness, experiencing the reality that the ideas of inner and outer are just that. They're ideas like time, like you, me. They're just ideas, wonderful ideas that allow us this human experience, but ideas nonetheless. The best way to come to this realization, of course, is experience. So we change our attitude and we see how form starts to change. radical gratitude would begin with gratitude. Really nice and simple. Taking a couple of minutes at the start of the day to express, feel what you are grateful for. Take a couple of minutes at the end of the day. Do that for 21 days and see what happens. Notice what shifts. We notice more and more of what we notice.
Yeah, I want to come back to that piece in a minute, because that's a really useful kind of practical piece of it. But you talked about the kind of non-dual kind of perspective on it, and I just wanted to come into that a little bit more. How do you... The question I want to ask is, how does someone come to that place? And of course, that's a whole other kind of thing in of itself. But let me put it like this: what's helped you in finding that place of kind of the sense of interconnectedness, and how has the finding of that place affected your experience?
So there is action and agency and practice. For me, I was fairly stubborn, so a lot of Zazen, Zen practice and various other forms of meditation. And
can you just describe the Zazen practice just very briefly?
so Zazen is simply to bring attention to what is. There are various levels and stages and forms and so on, but really it is beginning with concentration. So to learn to train the mind to concentrate on a specific point, on breath, on a koan, on mantra. Not mantra so much in Zazen, but that's the essence of meditation at that level, is to concentrate, is to train the mind to stay in one place, whether it's visually, whether it's internally, with thought, with breath, with sensation. And that's across all the traditions. It begins with that concentration. And there are two forms of Zen which offer a really nice model of the two approaches to experiencing what is already here now. You know, this enlightenment idea is a confusing one, because enlightenment, as I understand it, and there are many different versions, is simply ordinary mind. It's this experience, this awareness, when it notices that it is just this. And somehow that then comes back into the personal experience. So Rinzai Zen is about action, agency. We sit and we sit and we sit 20 hours. You know, it's a very male energy until enlightenment is experienced, or in Zen terms, a kensho or satori, an opening.
Yes.
Like, we get a sense.
You get a taste of something. Yeah.
Yeah, a taste, and that taste then might prompt us to continue practicing. Or go off and enjoy alcohol for a while and think we've got it all sorted out.
Yeah, exactly.
The other form of Zen, and I mention this because it just offers a really nice lens, is Soto Zen, which has a more feminine touch to it, where the idea is not that we strive for enlightenment, but we recognize our enlightenment and we sit to enjoy being enlightened. So these two approaches taken together, I believe, offer a balance. So there's a time to practice, there's a time to be rigorous, there's a time to make that commitment, to be disciplined, and there's a time to receive, to take a lot of walks in nature, to relax, to turn off the TV, and allow the intelligence that we are to evolve, which it will do with or without us.
Right.
It's just less painful when we go along for the ride.
Indeed. Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying there about the place of showing up to practice and the place of surrendering and allowing. I think that's just such a difficult integration for a lot of people. And maybe just pursuing that on the line of the more kind of active kind of piece, you started saying about the idea of taking a chunk of time, let's say at the start of the day or the end of the day, to actively practice gratitude.
Yes.
Can you say a bit more about that? That feels like a very useful kind of, specific, let's say, that someone can pursue.
Yes.
And I'm curious, is that something that you did, or was just naturally was happening anyway?
Absolutely. I think we naturally feel gratitude when good things happen. However, what neuroscience tells us these days is there's a wonderful book called Buddha's Brain by Rick Hanson, and he points to the evolutionary advantage of the brain, the mind, holding on to heavily traumatic experiences. If the tiger jumping out from behind the grass can be remembered, that could save your life next time. So the brain is set up to hold on to pain, experiences of threat and fear and so on. Similarly, or conversely, if we taste a really delicious mango as we're evolving thousands of years ago, there's not any real particular advantage to remember that. You don't need to taste good mango. It's just, so long as it nourishes you and has food, it's good enough. So when we understand there's a bias existing in the neurological structure that has evolved over these many years, we can start to correct that bias. Because what we also know is that the brain is neuroplastic. Neuroplasticity is one of the most profound discoveries of our time. It tells us that through changing the mind, we can change the physical structure of the brain. So we can train the mind to notice the good, to notice that which we value. And that's where the practice of gratitude comes in.
Yes, and I think, one of the things that kind of puzzles me in a sense is that the research on neuroplasticity has been around for a number of years, and yet there seems to have been a surprising lack of recognition in traditional, certainly, circles of going, we can train the brain. This is a kind of extraordinary kind of potential that's there. And so you were saying about, taking time each day to actually write down things that you're grateful for, or doing it out loud?
Great to do it verbally, or writing things down, however the mind works. For me, it was a writing practice that I would utilize for many years. And just to briefly touch upon the resistance that we find, because it's within us all. I spoke to a neurosurgeon who one would imagine is well trained and understanding the latest research in neuroplasticity. And when he mentioned that there might be some retardation after my surgery, I pointed out, well, that's no problem. I'm 31, I can just retrain it. It might take a while.
I remember reading that,
And he said to me that he's a skeptic. And I remember thinking, this is peer-reviewed, well-established data that's built up voluminously. It's not UFO sightings, I think, we're speaking about here. It's not something to be skeptical about. So when we recognize that resistance, we might find it in ourselves as well. And yet the way we overcome the resistance is to practice. Simply to have an open mind, to experiment. So yes, it could be that we start the day writing, say 5 things that we're grateful for, and feeling into that as well. So it's not like school that I've just got to do my 5 things and I'm done.
But it's not an intellectual exercise, it's an embodied exercise.
Both. Body, intellectual, emotional as well. And if you do that for 21 days, 21 days is the time frame that science suggests allows habits to become habits. If we do the same thing for 21 days, the brain starts to get used to it. And see what happens.
And I guess the days that we least feel like doing it, I guess are probably the days we most need to, because they're the days we're not in a place of gratitude at that point.
Absolutely. And at that point we might choose to be grateful for having the awareness, for having the practice, for being able to notice this emotion that's uncomfortable, for being able to choose to sit in front of the TV and eat chocolate if that's what we choose to do. Gratitude can be found in every experience.
And I guess there's also to be able to do the practice with someone else if someone has a romantic partner or kids or whatever, so to practice that. So we've got a couple of minutes left. I just wanted to come back to something you kind of touched on before, and I don't remember the exact quote in the book, but it was something along the lines of it's only when we truly surrender to what we're experiencing that we actually find the relief we're trying to find through running away and escaping. It's like we try and get away from our experience because we want to be free, but it's actually in the surrender. And maybe if you're just able to finish by saying something about that, and it feels to me that's been the heart of your practice. Maybe I'm wrong with it, but it feels like that's the essence of much of what you're teaching. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Einstein said the most important question we can ask is whether the universe is friendly. I would humbly, considering we're talking about Einstein, add that whether the universe has a sense of humor or not is an appropriate question as well. And I say that because when we resist something for a period of time, and we want to get rid of something for a period of time, and we discover that we are unsuccessful, and then we try a different approach, we embrace it, we surrender to it, we accept it, we love it, we might say, and we notice that the problem all along was not that which we thought was the problem. But it was our thinking that it was a problem that was problematic.
Yeah.
And in that moment, it's very funny to notice that in trying to get rid of it, I was actually perpetuating it. I was giving it energy. I was creating it.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And in cutting off that feed source, the energy, the resistance, we surrender, we offer gratitude. So there's many words that can point to this. We experience that release. And we notice that the transformation actually happens when we allow it to be as it is in that moment.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. And I really appreciate your time, Will. If people want to find more information on your book, Blessed with the Brain... I'm throwing on the floor. Your book, Blessed with the Brain Tumor. And also I know you're running various talks and workshops and book signings. They go to willpye.com.
That's correct.
Yeah, and that's Pye spelled P-Y-E. I'm sure it'll come up on the screen as well.
That's right.
So great. Well, thank you, Will.
It's been a joy, Alex.
Thank you. And thank you for watching. And we look forward to talking with you again, hopefully very soon on Conscious Tea. Bye-bye.